So, welcome everybody. I think we'll get started. This is Water Wednesday. Our topic today is Potomac Fever, Reflections on the Nation's River. Ashley, I think we can get rid of our starting screen. I was playing as people were coming in the Bach Cello Suite #1 in G major Prelude. Yo-Yo Ma said on some podcast that he was having trouble playing that passage perfectly, that suite perfectly. And then he thought of a river, and he thought about putting his hands into the river and coming sort of the middle of something that was eternal. And then he could play that passage beautifully. And I love that story. So I thought I'd start with that. I'm Peggy Knutson. Welcome, everybody. I am the Vice President of Development for the Potomac River Keepers. As most of you know, our three river keepers, one each for the Potomac, the Upper Potomac, and the Shenandoah, along with dozens and dozens of volunteers, patrol the Potomac watershed to stop pollution where it happens. We assess where and how the pollution is taking place. We enforce compliance of existing laws and regulations, including taking legal action where necessary. And we work with you, the community, to help us monitor the rivers and help us advocate to keep them fishable, swimmable, and drinkable for years to come. So thank you for joining us today. I am joined by Charlotte Taylor Fryar, a writer, historian, educator. I just found out that she is teaching 11th graders today, and an herbalist, which I found out when I read her book. So you're ahead of me. I think I can take lessons from you, Charlotte. She holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where her dissertation won multiple awards for innovations in public and digital scholarship. Charlotte has just published her debut nonfiction book, Potomac Fever, Reflections on the Nation's River. One reviewer calls this book, quote, provocative. Starting with a love of the river and the plants around it, the evocative descriptions are joined by political and social histories that define who lives where and the impacts of pollution and climate change. This is an important read about a place that defines us all. So first, some housekeeping. I have some questions for Charlotte, and then we'll open up the floor at about 1/2 for your questions and discussion. If you could mute your audio until you want to ask a question, that would be great. Also, if you want your cameras on or off, that's completely up to you. We are comfortable either way. So welcome, Charlotte. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much. I did have to say there's no way you could have known this, Peggy, but in a former life I was a cellist, and I did know that story about Yo-Yo Ma and that beautiful and like iconic cello suite of Bach's, which I used to love playing so much when I was still playing, because it does have that kind of rolling beauty of a river. So this is all to say, like, what a wonderful way to start us off.
Terrific. Thank you. So, Charlotte, can you tell us about your background and how you came to write Potomac Fever?
Yeah, of course. Um, I think my sort of background in some ways is kind of dual. As you said when you introduced me, I'm a historian and I'm also an herbalist. And I think there have been times where those two things have very much felt in tension with one another. Um, I went through lots of graduate school. I went to UNC Chapel Hill, and I I have been telling people as I've been going on these book events and book talks that I came to write Potomac Fever by accident. And it that's a little bit silly, but it's also a little bit true. I began writing Potomac Fever when I was working on my dissertation, which was about something totally different. It was about racial justice movements in North Carolina. And the reason that I started writing this book is in some ways to sort of, quite frankly, distract myself from like what I thought was my real work, writing a dissertation, the thing you have to do to earn a PhD. But it also sort of helped me get started writing in the morning. So I had moved to Washington, D.C. in 2016. I would wake up in the mornings, and in order to sort of get started writing for the day, I would take the dog out for a walk along the Potomac. This was a little bit near Little Falls for people who have their local geography. Go for a walk, and while I would go on that walk, I'd go out for about an hour every morning. Um, I would just sort of I would pay attention. I would look around and see what was around me. I was learning some new plants. I've always been a plant person, but it hadn't really been something that I thought about formally in any way. Go out for these walks, pay attention to what was going on around me. And I think I started taking notes, and I really just took notes on my phone. I think sometimes people think that you would like write something down, but I was just taking pictures, writing notes. And then I would come home after that, just like little hour-long walk, and I would begin to type up those notes. And that was what helped me get started writing and like sort of jumpstart the process of writing my dissertation. I really didn't think about these notes as something that was going to turn into an actual project. And it's not that I didn't take them seriously. It's just I thought about it as a tool that would help me write something different. Um, but lo and behold, like after, a year or so of doing this, it's like I had all of these like rambling notes. It certainly wasn't a book, but it had turned into a real project of like deep attention to the Potomac's ecology and its geography. And because of my historical training and background, also history. And I started to think about those things a little bit deeper. And at some point, I did realize that these notes could be the basis of a book. Also, during that time too, though, like as I said, like I had become deeply interested in the Potomac's plant life, which I really hope we'll be able to talk about a little bit more, what makes the ecology, oh my gosh, and the botany of the Potomac so unique and so captivating. Um, and it is not an overstatement to say that I had fallen like head over heels in love with the Potomac's plant life, which was sort of the shock of my life. Just like truly like any love affair, you're like, wow, did this happen? And it is truly how I felt about encountering like little blue stem grass up near Great Falls. Like I said, I am a plant person. I love to garden. I love to be outside, but I hadn't fallen this deeply in love with plants before, and it was a little bit of a shock, in part because of this background. So that's all sort of a long-winded way of saying I had this sort of background in history and formal historian type thinking. At the same time, though, I had fallen in love with plants, and I was like, if I don't pursue this in some way, if I don't figure out a way to work with these plants, to know them deeply, to know them better, like I will regret it. So I ended up going to herbalism school to study the uses of plants, but also I think a little bit more about their sort of connection with the local ecology. Those things I think paired together um, helped shape the direction of this book in ways that I'm not sure I knew would happen at the beginning of it. I think when I had pulled together my notes that I had taken from all those morning walks, I was like, oh, what an interesting history. Lots of good notes here about the geography. But again, sort of pairing together more history thinking, more ecology and botany thinking, that ended up forming the core of the book. And of course, too, I want to say that like I had not only fallen in love with the plant life of the Potomac, it soon spilled out into like a real love affair with the Potomac itself. Also the surprise of my life.
That really comes through in your passion, Charlotte. And may I ask a sensitive question? Which was finished,
Yeah.
your dissertation or the book?
Oh, my dissertation for sure. But I
Sure.
will say, like, um, I remember finishing it, not quite in a rush, but I wanted to get to this. I like wanted to get to this project. And there are ways that I think writing, and it comes through in certain chapters in the book, there are ways in which writing about the history of North Carolina helped me better understand the history of Washington, D.C., which in some ways is dictated by folks. Maybe we'll talk about this later, but there's an element of North Carolina, South Carolina culture that's present in Washington, D.C. And I think in some ways that it ended up informing each other.
Exactly. You do write about movements north, and it wasn't only the South to Chicago. There were a lot of Carolinians who came to DC. But let's start with the name, and we will
Yeah.
get to the ecology and the plants. And I learned so much from reading your book. I could imagine the colonial settlers, 250 years ago, maybe foraging for the same plants you were foraging for. But at any rate, we're going to start with the name. How did you settle on this name, and what is Potomac fever?
Oh, yeah, sure. Um, Well, Potomac Fever, I think as I've been doing these talks, I've been asking people, and I would maybe do it here, like raise of hands if you have ever heard that phrase. And I keep getting mixed results. Some, yeah, okay, Peggy knows it, but Potomac Fever, I think, is a term. It really emerged in the 70s, I'm going to say like 60s, 70s, as sort of a anti-liberal term to describe people who have moved to Washington, D.C., or like a political job. They've come to work in a certain administration, and they get addicted to the money and power of Washington, D.C., and then they end up staying. So, you get tapped to serve as the vice chair of whatever office in the Federal Reserve, and you just get hooked on the power, and then you settle in and you have got Potomac Fever. And there's something about the sort of like there's connotations too with the swampiness of Washington, D.C. and the sort of miasma of the old mud flats, and you just get sick the longer you stay here. This is not how I feel about Washington, D.C., of course. And I really don't think people use the phrase that much, but it's still an attitude that people take towards Washington, D.C. I think there's a way in which even people who like they understand on one surface that it is a very real city where people live. There's still this deep association with the city, with the federal government, and with a negative view of the federal government. And I think it can be really hard to untie those things. Potomac Fever also has it also owes something to George Washington, which we were talking about a little bit before this recording started. I guess it's hard to tell the story sort of in a tidy summation, but George Washington was deeply, deeply passionate about the Potomac River. He really did believe that it should be the center of, this new country that he had helped found. And there are many reasons why he believed that, part of which, he had real estate investments up the Potomac. And of course, he lived on the Potomac, the lower Potomac. That's where Mount Vernon is. But I think when you read his letters and you understand a little bit more about, even as he's president and even as commander in chief, he spent so much time thinking about this river. And even when you go to Mount Vernon, if you go to his house, it's currently under renovation right now, but if you go into the main living room, in the living room of Mount Vernon are not portraits of his family, they're portraits of the river. And you get the sense this guy really, really loved the Potomac River. And I read a couple of historians who had described his kind of interest, his obsession with the Potomac as Potomac Fever. Again, this idea that like he was so overtaken by it, obsessed with it, that it like got into him. And there's many letters of when visitors would come to his house and he'd entertain them on the portico of Mount Vernon, which has that fabulous view over the river. It's over Piscataway Park on the Maryland side now. He was just so proud of it and deeply loved it. And he also deeply wanted people's monetary investments in being able to develop the Potomac Canal Company and also the city itself once the city had been established as the future capital of the United States. So there's sort of two realms there, neither of which I like fully jive with. My obsession with the Potomac, as I feel like I've already explained, like deep love and the surprise of my life. But I certainly am not in love with Washington, D.C. or the Potomac because of reasons of money and power. That didn't really make sense to me, right? Like I teach high school. I don't have a lot of money or power. But I do love this city in such a deep way. And I have met so many people over the years I've lived here who feel the same way. And I think when I settled on that title, a book that's a little bit about the relationship between the Potomac River and Washington, D.C., I wanted to choose a title that it's almost like it reclaims that phrase or that title for people who love this city and care for it, not because of the connections to the federal government or the relationship to power or to development in the way that George Washington thought about it, but really love the city on its own terms, which includes a deep love for its ecology, its geography, and even its history, the good and the bad.
Beautiful, Charlotte. Thank you. So let's go to the beginning of your love. When it was, I think it might have been love at first sight. You were 16 or so, and you'd been dragged to Washington. Well, dragged is maybe the wrong word. You were
Well, I was
excited to
dragged.
go.
I was
Yeah,
dragged.
okay. But every 16-year-old is, on the cusp of, I love you, I love you, I want to go off on my own
Mhm.
family. So anyway, you came to Washington with your parents for the first time, I think. You described something we've all experienced. You're being dragged around from monument to monument in the heat, crowds of tourists all around you. You're at the Lincoln Memorial. You're hot and tired, even as you are also deeply moved, and you've just come from a sophomore or junior class about the Civil War. You're deeply moved by the words of Lincoln's second inaugural address engraved there at the Lincoln Memorial, where he writes, with malice toward none. Now that this battle is over, and I've been elected president again, let us move forward with malice toward none, with charity for all. Let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind the nation's wounds. I love that passage too. So 16-year-old Charlotte breaks away from her family, hot and sweaty, and goes to sit on the back steps of the memorial, where you put your head in your arms. And read for us that passage, page 31, paragraph 2, 16-year-old Charlotte here.
I should say too, to give a date to this, I was 16 in 2000, and I guess this would have been the summer of 2008. And so I was also at the time like fueled by this idea that the person running for president, Barack Obama, could change the country. I was a very, capital H, hope-filled teenager. All right. I was a teenager, too embarrassed to show how thrilled I was to be with my family on the nation's capital. Oh no, this is a different section, my bad. All right. When I lifted my head, I saw the sun sinking into a glowing haze across the Potomac. The blue river stained orange, now red, now pink. The elegance of a white columned house atop a far hill to the south, a wide bridge ferrying people across the water, flanked with golden statues of men on winged horses, and again the blue water flowing east towards the bay and out to the ocean. I was awestruck by the sight, and even more so by the fact, confirmed by my isolation, that I was the only one who had ever taken in this breathtaking view. For several years into my young adulthood, I maintained a false belief, easily overturned if seriously considered, that I had discovered that space, and thus the view from the back of the Lincoln Memorial remained uniquely mine.
Thank you. That's like every 16-year-old. I'm the only one who's ever fallen in love. That's great. So what else do you remember from that moment? What struck you about the Potomac that day?
Yeah, well, again, I was 16. I had all these, as many 16-year-olds do, I had all these sort of nascent, inchoate ideas about what a nation is and what even the capital was. I had visited before, but I had never, not in any kind of deep way. And this felt like my first like adult trip to Washington, D.C. And I was equipped with the kind of history that would allow me to engage with the place. You can tell what a serious teenager I was. And I remember looking across the river and like thinking it was beautiful, like just gorgeous. But I think what struck me at the time was the way in which the river seemed to connect a country that felt so vast and unknown to me as a young person. But through that space. But like I said, I was also 16. There's so much I did not know. I did not know that the river connects there intentionally with the bridge, the Lincoln Memorial, and then across the river, Robert E. Lee's home, Arlington House. And Memorial Bridge is placed there as a bridge between the North and the South. And there's a uncomfortable, to say the least, sort of equating that happens in that space across the river. I didn't know that, but I still think I sensed it in some way, that this was a space of connection, and a space of sort of flow, that this river, more so than any other river, and I only knew the ones really from my home in North Carolina, so certainly more than the Watauga River or the Cape Fear River or something like that down in North Carolina, that the Potomac represented some coalescence of what it is to be an American. And I think there is something about rivers that lends themselves very well to metaphor. And I had that sort of young teenage sense of that. Over time, not to spoil the entire book, but over time, that idea became a little bit more complicated, that the Potomac is not only sort of some ultimate space of American coalescence, it can be a space of division just as well as it can be a space of unity.
Beautiful. And I think that George Washington was hoping for that, that unity, the river being used to unify, especially when he had the thought to make the C&O Canal go on all the way up to Cumberland. which is it's not a part I'm having you read from Charlotte, but it just that's a kind of Potomac fever where we're thinking the river can unify that you have in common with George Washington. And I had no idea that he had been the sort of the brainchild of that idea of building that C&O Canal, which many of us enjoy today as one of the largest parks in the area. I think it's 186 miles all along
Yeah.
the river. You can bike and
Mhm.
hike, and I've done a lot of that. So let's fast forward in your journey to the
Mhm.
chapter called Ephemerals.
Oh
You
yeah.
talk about getting an unexpected, you're more of an adult now. You talk
Yeah.
about getting an unexpected tour of the Potomac from the air and
Mhm.
how this unexpected tour inspired you to hike the river as much as you could once you
Mhm.
were back on the ground. So if you could start, please, on page 62, paragraph 3, where you're flying into DC.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is from sort of the first year or so I lived in the city, 2016, 2017. Um, I was really just coming to know the city. And well, I'll just read it. On a flight home from a cousin's wedding, the pilot overshot the descent into Reagan National Airport. Perhaps we were forced to dawdle before the plane was allowed to land. Riding low over the river, we circled the airfield and the Washington Monument, then headed northwest, the Potomac growing thinner as we flew against the current. 15 miles and half a minute later, we cruised over an epic set of rapids. White water shot through the rocky gorge of Great Falls, and spectacular cliffs hung over the waterfalls, creating a craggy, almost alpine scene that brought to mind some place more akin to Yosemite than the nation's capital. The pilot then turned us southeast, back in the direction of our destination, and I watched the river transform from frothing white to stone-studded green to a final muddy churn as we again passed over the airport without landing. A minute later, the Potomac had turned wide and flat, without so much as a pebble ruffling the surface. I saw George Washington's family home and slave labor camp, Mount Vernon, resting alone on its pleasant hill, looming over the tidal water below. Pressing my nose against layers of glass, I had watched the terrain shift from mountains to sea, the district a bridge between them. The pilot made one final turn, and our impromptu tour of the various geographies comprising the greater Washington, D.C. metropolitan area now complete, we finally landed, though I could have flown those 30 miles forever, watching the Potomac shrink and spread.
I love this part in particular because it discusses the breathtaking changes that the
Mhm.
Potomac takes as it makes its way from the Appalachians to the Atlantic. So, boy, I would have loved to have that airplane tour as well, Charlotte.
Yeah.
Um, can you talk about the varied ecology of the Potomac and what
Mhm.
makes it so unusual? What
Yeah.
happens as it flows south and east from the mountains through DC and on to the Chesapeake?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like I do sometimes think if I had moved someplace further down the river or further up the river, I think I would have the love I'm sure still would have been there. But there's something so unique about the area around Washington, D.C. that makes the ecology of the river so distinct. And of course has to do with the geography. So as we've already discussed, like Washington, D.C., and therefore the Potomac is situated somewhat in the middle between sort of north and south geographically. And as a result, we have some really interesting plants that are from more northern areas, and we have some from more southern areas. And they all sort of live somewhat happily together. Um, but also between sort of east and west, Washington, D.C. is situated right on what's called the fall line, this area where the Piedmont breaks into the coastal plain. And the sort of fall line zone is the area between Great Falls-ish down to Washington, D.C.-ish. Some people say the Anacostia River, as the largest tributary of the Potomac, marks that sort of final transition area on the fall line. And in that space, like you have a more northern geography, you've got a southern geography or ecology rather. You've got a little bit more west, you got a little bit more east, and all of those things meet and combine in what is really a really tight geographical area. Washington, D.C., even the Washington, D.C. greater metropolitan area is still really small comparatively. And so in a very tight space, especially along the river corridor, you just have a really concentrated and diverse ecology of plants that are sort of able to survive, or not survive, thrive, um, in these kind of conflicting ecologies. You also have, because of the Potomac's flow, this has to do a little bit with hydrology, because the Potomac has, obviously, like many rivers on the East Coast, sort of a far reach up in the mountains, it carries seeds from mountain plants in the current. And when the water rises, particularly in the gorge, this is the area between sort of Great Falls and the 495 bridge, the American Legion Bridge, in that sort of area, the water will rise really, really fast. And so when it rises during periods of floods, those mountain seeds that are carried in the current, they get deposited in the gorge. And so you end up with like more mountainous plants actually that are part of that gorge. In the Potomac Gorge area, which is again sort of Great Falls to Little Falls, a little bit north of the city, there scientists have identified, I think it's 36 distinct plant communities. And for those of us who are not trained ecologists, including yours truly, like that's a really high number for such a small area, relatively. And three of those 36 plant communities, they're not found anywhere else in the world.
Wow.
So it gives you a sense not only of like, it gives you a sense of just how varied the ecology is. Again, in this little space, because Washington, D.C. is sort of a meeting place between southern plants, northern plants, eastern plants, western plants. And I think you can, for those of us who live in Washington, D.C., you can get a sense of this even traveling around the city. It does not take a great scientific mind. I actually took some students out this past weekend and we were talking about it. Rock Creek Park, with its great rocky ravines and its beautiful eastern hemlocks that are up on the rocks, is just different in feeling than maybe the wetlands along the Anacostia River. And those are really only separated by 5 miles. But even when within that sort of tight space, you have a period of transition, and our city sort of sits, Washington, D.C. sits on that period of transition. Um, that area, again, like the 15, 30 miles between sort of that tidal area, now down near Mount Vernon and then up to Great Falls and a little bit beyond, it's an incredible space of transition. And of course, it happens along that sort of river corridor.
Beautiful. It's it's a time where I think I'd like to get to the heart of what Potomac River Keepers is all about, with that beautiful river and the description that you have so wonderfully drawn there, Charlotte. Our goal is to keep the Potomac and its tributaries clean for generations to come. So in your first chapter, you talk about not only how unique the Potomac is, which is part of its story as a river that travels through so many geological areas, as you just described. You also cover the struggle to keep it clean. So if you don't mind, could you please read your page 36, paragraph 2?
Absolutely. And yet along and in these waterways is a seemingly endless fount of astonishments. In what other major American city could you expect to see dolphins finning the water as bald eagles soar overhead? Where in New York or Chicago or Atlanta will you find roaring waterfalls, ferny ravines, and sandy beaches all in the same zip code? Along the Potomac and its tributaries, very narrow strips of public land, some no wider than 500 feet, protect the region's rarest species and preserve some of its most striking landscapes. In this way, city and nature are largely concurrent in DC, eroding a dichotomy that defines the dominant American relationship to public lands. In many neighborhoods across the city, you can leave your 20-story apartment building or step out of a liquor store with a six-pack, walk a single block, and there you are, already deep into a network of forested trails, lost in the woods and so lost in the city. Though today the Potomac is an apparent model of ecological urban stewardship, judging by the numbers of hikers, bikers, climbers, and kayakers who flock to its verdant trails, most of the 20th century the river sloshed with acid mine drainage, raw sewage, and erosive sediment. In 1954, the only creatures that could be found living on the bed of the river were sewage worms. And in 1967, a river fountain gifted by Lady Bird Johnson had to be removed after it was found to be spraying coliform bacteria across a nearby park. For decades, fish kills and algae mats heralded the start of every summer in the capital. By the early 1970s, industrial development, coal mining pollution, and municipal neglect, each supported by narratives rooted in white supremacy and myths of boundless capitalist progress, had very nearly destroyed the Potomac River.
So it's incredible to think that in just a mere, 100 years, the river was swimmable and then definitely not swimmable in the 50s, 60s, and 70s until we got some legislation passed in the 70s. And that's what the river keepers work on, to us aspiring to have the Potomac be swimmable again. And I'll ask Ashley to share our slide from 100 years ago, because I learned so much from your book, Charlotte. I had heard that the Potomac had once been swimmable, but if you can believe this, this is the tidal basin in the early 1920s. And that is not only swimmable, that looks pretty mobbed from citizens here. On the left, you can see many of you may have already seen this. There was a regulation as to how short the bathing suits those woolen bathing suits could be for women. And there's a man measuring the distance from swimsuit bottom to the knee. And then on the right, you can see some incredible athletics. I think those are two people somersaulting together into the Potomac. It did blow my mind that what closed down the tidal basin in the mid 1920s was not pollution, but the fact that there were calls to segregate the swimming to allow Black people to swim as well. So if you look at these slides, you won't see any people of color there. And rather than cave to that call, they just shut down the swimming in the tidal basin. And then, of course, we get on to the 50s, 60s, and 70s to where the river was definitely unswimmable. So again, the Clean Water Act of 1972 was game-changing and is a core of our work today, which is getting polluters to stop using this and other, stop. And we base our calls to stop polluting on this legislation and others. So thank you, Ashley, for that view back in time. I would have loved to have been there. That sounds like just what you'd love to do on a hot Washington day. Your next chapter talks about the bald eagle, the symbol of our nation, and how that bird and many others were threatened with extinction due to habitat loss, hunting, and man-made pest control substances like DDT. So you write that there were fewer than 1,000 bald eagles estimated to exist in 1962 when Rachel Carson published her famous book, Silent Spring. And Rachel Hart helped spark an environmental and conservation movement that led to the US outlawing DDT in 1972. So this is all good data for me to have and to use as we fight for cleaner rivers here at the Potomac Riverkeeper Network. But Charlotte, can you tell us what led you to research Rachel Carson? And I had no idea that she was a Silver Spring resident when she was working on that book. That's a suburb of DC. And what, if anything, surprised you about her work, or left a deep impression or a lesson with you in that research you did on her?
Yeah, I mean, she is, it feels like such a vast understatement to say that she is such a hero of mine. She's responsible for creating any kind of safety or health we have in this world. Like such a it's such an important thing. What has been, I think, like remarkable is that I did not read Silent Spring until much later in my life. And actually the book that I read of hers is The Sea Around Us, this great, beautiful book about the magic and mystery of oceans. Um, I think prior to that, I had always imagined Rachel Carson as like living in Maine or some place. I certainly didn't imagine her ever living in like a city. I didn't imagine her living in a suburb. I imagined her living in some idyllic rural place by the ocean, where she could wade in tide pools. And so I really don't actually remember when I found out that she lived in Washington, D.C. while she was working on Silent Spring. But as soon as I did that, I was like, well, where did she live? Like, I want to know where it is. And I found out that her home is now it's like a historic, it's on the like historic register. And now it's still a private home. You can't go knock on the door, but you can go walk by it, which is what I did many times. And I think I wanted to know like a little bit more about how living in such a space, Silver Spring is a suburb that really exploded in popularity when she lived there during the 50s and 60s. Um, I think I wanted to understand better how living in such a place impacted the writing of this book that, again, like it is responsible for any kind of health that this world has. I already said earlier, I teach 11th graders. We just did a class discussion reading a section of Silent Spring, and it hit me anew hearing my students discuss it, just how normal the idea of widespread pesticide use like that was during the time, and therefore how, well, it's complicated, but my students encountered it as like strange. Like, why would you spray poisons everywhere? To which I was like, children, like it still happens. But at any rate, I wanted to go and sort of see what surroundings would have inspired her while writing this book. So I remember visiting her house. She lived along a branch of the Anacostia River, up in sort of northern Silver Spring, again, for those of us with that DC geography. And the more I think I learned about that area and thought about her visiting Rock Creek Park and going to go listen for the wood thrushes and the veeries. Obviously, the silence of Silent Spring is the silence of no bird song. I mean, like as I have said many times, like I'm a trained historian, like automatically I'm thinking about the history of that place. And so I wanted to know more about the history of Silver Spring, what makes it different than the history of other neighborhoods in and around Washington, D.C. And Silver Spring was founded really as it was initially sort of farmland, as many areas around Washington, D.C. were. And then later it became a very popular suburb that many white Washingtonians moved to as they were leaving the city during the 50s and 60s during the era of white flight. Um, it was also a deeply segregated suburb. It was a sundown town. Black folks weren't allowed to be in Silver Spring after a certain period of time, and there were bus lines that like ran from Silver Spring to Black neighborhoods in the city, because Black folks, of course, worked in homes and even worked in build businesses, and they built so much of what we now think of as downtown Silver Spring. And it is therefore, I guess I will say at the very least, uncomfortable to think about Rachel Carson, a woman who devoted herself to, I don't think it's too grand to say life, um, also living in a place that was devoted to segregation and dehumanization in many ways. And I think I really wanted to sort of understand the legacy of such an important person in the context of the place she lived in Washington, D.C. And there are many reasons she lived there. Some was proximity to some of the federal agencies that she relied on to do the incredible research of Silent Spring. As I said too, she loved bird watching, and there's many beautiful parks in Silver Spring. She often went into sort of northern Rock Creek Park to listen for the wood thrush, which is the bird of Washington, D.C., now very much endangered because
Did
of
not know we
deforestation.
had a bird. I guess every state has a bird. Why shouldn't we have a
Yeah.
bird? Wood thrush,
Yeah. I would have called it a state bird, but Washington, D.C. is not a state.
as we
Um,
know. Yeah.
yeah, no, yeah. But it's a district bird, but again, the numbers are much declined since Rachel Carson's time, in part because of the kind of suburban development that Silver Spring is a sort of legacy and of. Um, Whenever it's still to this day, that was one of the very earliest chapters I wrote, because I remember living on the Potomac and I had seen bald eagles before, but then there was a period of time where I saw them every day. I saw one this morning, actually. I saw a juvenile bald eagle this morning along the river. Anyway, I thought about her all the time because of that section in Silent Spring where she says, like, we're going to need a new national bird if these keep dying. Um, because it seemed like such a powerful sort of metaphor. And I still think about her all the time and still think of her as someone who, while committed to life, like deeply committed to the continuation of life on this planet, um, also could in her personal life and in her personal sorrows. I mean, she as a person was dealing with so many difficult things in her life. Um,
Like her mother, she was taking care of her sick mother and a niece. I can't remember exactly.
and I think a niece or a nephew.
Yeah.
She also had been diagnosed with breast cancer.
Ugh.
She also was in love with a woman named Dorothy that, like, she really couldn't openly be with, and they fought often about like what her work was doing. Um, she was dying at the same time that she wrote Silent Spring, a fact that like when you think about that is all the more impressive, I think, again, about the way in which that book is so devoted to life. Um, but all of that also combined with the fact that I'm sure it was so comfortable for her to live in Silver Spring, a place that was almost designed for sort of the comforts of white Washingtonians who wanted to get away from black Washingtonians and move there. And so many of the advertisements drawing people to Silver Spring, like that was like headlined, right?
Yeah,
So,
wow, wow. Well, we've come a long way since then, but we still have a long way to go. You
indeed.
mentioned Rachel Carson. I just want to take this one quote from her book, Silent Spring. It's very short. Those who contemplate the beauty of the earth find reserves of strength that will endure as long as life lasts. I love that quote. And for those of you who are inspired by that quote, I'd like to just let you know that this Saturday, PRKN is hosting its annual Oxen Run cleanup in Prince George's County. This is our largest river cleanup of the year. More than 200 people will come together to pick up trash. Maybe Ashley can drop the sign up into our chat. Otherwise, you're welcome to write to me. Ashley can drop my email into the chat. But over the last 5 years, according to our Potomac River keeper, Dean Nauyuks, we have removed more than 50,000 plastic bottles, more than 1,000 bags of trash, and 250 tires in the Oxen Cove cleanup alone. So we're still taking volunteers for this event on Saturday. Feel free to sign up. For those of you who don't want to maybe get your boots and your gloves dirty, or maybe you're not even into fishing or kayaking or boating and you don't have Potomac fever the way Charlotte and I do. Um, what do you think, Charlotte? What would you recommend to people who do not yet have a connection to the river to connect with the Potomac or the Shenandoah or any of the hundreds of tributaries that make up our 14,500 plus square mile watershed?
Sure. Um, Maybe it will sound silly, but if you drink water in the Washington, D.C. area, you already have a relationship to the Potomac River. Um, and so I do think whatever way is a comfortable way to get near the river. You don't have to get in it. You don't have to go kayaking. You certainly don't have to swim if that's a scary thing. But I do think, as I said before, like there are so many different geographies, there's so many different spaces where you can have a relationship to the river, that doesn't necessarily involve what we would maybe necessarily call formal recreation. To be able to spend time with it, I think is important. I also like as I have said many times, like my life was deeply changed simply by walking along the river. And you can do that on trails, and you can do that on paved surfaces, and you can do that on a bike, and you can do that, even I just went down to the wharf last weekend and I was reminded like what a developed and yet intimate space that can be for relating to the river. Our city is very lucky in that it's situated, between these two vast and beautiful rivers, and there's so many different places that you can find some kind of little crook or little cove somewhere that you can find a place to be. I'm thinking too of the Rachel Carson quote you just read, Peggy, because I think it's sometimes hard to ask people to care for something that they don't know. Um, and I would say for many people who maybe don't have a relationship to the Potomac or to any of the rivers or tributaries that might be close to them, you have to know it before you can come to love and want to care for it. I do think there's a way in which like intimacy creates the conditions for responsibility, and for care. And so I guess I would encourage folks in whatever way feels good and comfortable for them to spend as you would with a person, if you want to get to know them, to spend time with the river, whether that's walking or biking or the more adventurous kayaking, swimming, etc. And it does sound like the trash pickups you mentioned are a good way to understand, number one, obviously spend time with the rivers, but also to understand what is more visible, perhaps than other forms of pollution or development threat that the river always faces.
Thank you, Charlotte. So much later than I had hoped. I'll open it up to see if there are any questions from our audience, and we'll give it a few beats. And if you do want to ask a question, you'll have to unmute yourself, and you can come on camera or not, depending on whether you want to. But I'll just give it a few beats, and we'll play a little bit of Yo-Yo Ma maybe in the meantime,
Oh,
just
it's
a few seconds. Let's see. Okay, Charlotte, now I want to know how long you've been playing the cello. This is a little off topic, but
oh
I'm
yeah.
an amateur musician myself.
Yeah, no, I mean I began playing when I was a child and I played through graduate school. So I played until I was about 25 and I haven't played in a long time, but I think it's not like a sad thing for me. I think there were other things in my life that came to feel more meaningful than regularly playing with an orchestra as I had been doing. But
Yeah,
I don't really necessarily describe myself again as a musician because I really don't play that much anymore. But I still retain all of this like musical knowledge and experience and love the cello and will sing its praises as the best and finest of all string instruments.
that's great.
Something it has such a depth of resonance.
Perfect. We have someone who asked, can you share what you just played? And I'll put a little YouTube uh, URL in there as well. And again, my goal would be to also get Yo-Yo Ma on here one of these days. He might even say yes, because that story about him putting the hands in the river and then being able to play that suite better just really gets to my heart. Okay, I'll do maybe two more.
Sure.
So folks, if you're too shy to ask the question personally, feel free to pop it in the chat. Um, and a lot of people probably, Charlotte, have not read the book or had even
Mhm.
time to buy it, but that's fine. I'm going to do a couple more questions. You blend memoir and history in your writing. So how do you balance those two elements? It was so deeply personal, Charlotte, and so deeply historical. And you didn't live back then. So it's sort of like, how do you bring all of that together? Is that a struggle?
Um, oh, the classic answer, yes and no. Um, no, in that one, my PhD and background is in a field called American Studies. And American Studies is sort of an interdisciplinary field. It blends geography and sociology and history and literature. It's a real mismatch of stuff. And I chose it as a field of study because it allowed me to do the thing that I most wanted to do as a scholar, which was to think about landscape as a historical text. And what I guess that means in practice is that whenever I am visiting a new place, including maybe a place I had just moved to, like Washington, D.C., being able to understand elements of geography, ecology, the development of a city, where certain neighborhoods are, what the demographics are, sort of sociological questions with geography, all of those things, like that helps me understand the history of a place much better than, in some cases, going to the archive and reading a historical document. You have to have all of those things.
Mhm.
I think I like this, and it is like the main sort of text, I guess a scholar would say I use to think about any place I visit because I get to like put my body into the landscape itself. Like I have to walk it to actually get the history. I have never been one of those dutiful historians who's able to read all of the texts and spend all of the time in the archives, and that's enough for me to tell the story. Like I have to go there. I have to walk it. I kind of have to feel it. Um, when that happens, though, you end up yourself being part of the story. And so that's the sort of like no answer to your question. I'm like, it's natural that there's certain memoir elements, I think, that end up in the telling of the history because I can feel it better. I think one good example of this is the essay that's a little bit about the history of segregated swimming in the Potomac. Like that really began because I had begun swimming in the Potomac and I loved it. And I wanted to know why it wasn't like a legal thing you could do. and folks will read it to find out more. But that's a good example. But also, as you said, like I think blending memoir and history is also tricky in its own way because you want a balance. You don't want too much of yourself, um, nor do you want the history to feel um, like it doesn't have any kind of backing. One thing I'm always reminded of in my classroom is I can spew historical facts all day long to my 11th graders, but it doesn't like mean anything to them until they can understand like what is a personal or sometimes maybe a familial or friend connection to the history. Until you understand like what is the personal impact, what makes this thing intimate and meaningful, it facts are just facts.
Mhm.
Even no matter how good the story is, no matter how good the history is, um, it doesn't mean anything until there's a personal impact. And so I tried my best in this work to balance them and blend them in a way so that, my story, my relationship to the Potomac, my love story, if you will, it helps bring people into what can maybe be less intimate histories, such as the development of the C&O Canal, which is interesting. I love it. I think about it all the time. But again, without that sort of personal connection, for some readers, it may feel a little bit like, oh, great, I'll file that away instead of holding it like in your heart.
Yes. My partner and I are frequently driving around up and down those locks. We have a cabin near Largent in West Virginia, and one of his goals is to just go visit every one of those really out there locks, and
Yeah.
every single one is just so beautiful. So I have a home in Brunswick, but this cabin is another hour and a quarter out. So I can really relate to the beauty of those canals. And there are indeed at several of them outfitters with kayaks that where you can get into the river. Um,
Mhm.
and this just harkens back to the bald eagle. I do a lot of kayaking and I see bald eagles almost every weekend when I'm out there. So that's a success story to
Yeah.
start. We're kind of moving a little bit towards our closing here. Talk about we can talk about the success of bringing back the eagles. There are now many, many more eagles than bald eagles than there were 100 years ago, right, Charlotte?
Yeah, that's right. The it's three states. It's Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware. I think it was a couple of years ago, the Baltimore Sun reported that they had like by percentage the largest comeback since the 1960s, when Silent Spring is published and DDT is later banned. Um, I confess I don't remember the exact number of mating pairs, but it is rather significant. I will say though, in Washington, D.C., like in the district, and again, it is a small area, there's usually the last 7 or 8 years, there's only been one mating pair. They always mate in the National Arboretum. And I don't know, this is worth considering. What it is about the development of our city and the kind of old forest growth that is not as uh, not as accessible, I guess, that would perhaps prevent bald eagles from being in and around the city, but you still see them. I write about in the book, walking down 14th Street in Columbia Heights, a very developed part of the city, by the Giant and the Old Navy and the Metro stop. And one day seeing a bald eagle, fly not high in the sky, like right low. And it was such a moment of realizing that even with our city's development and um, yeah, such incredible growth and all those things, there are still ways in which these animals are always in the city. And it's certainly not just eagles in the sky. Um, One sort of small delight of taking this book out on tour and talking to folks is that people just tell you their plant stories or their animal stories, their nature stories. And so I am now so happily inundated with people's stories of that one time they saw a fox out in, Union Market or something like that. And it happens more than you think.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, Rock Creek Park especially,
Yes,
but not only. And Elizabeth Ransom has written "Bald Eagles Fly by My 11th Floor Window in Arlington." So you get to see, perhaps you can see the Washington Monument and bald eagles. That must be quite a view.
that's really cool.
Yeah. Elizabeth, hello. Thank you for your comments.
Hi.
It sounds like you're outside right now. Wonderful.
Yeah, I am taking a little break outside. That's why I turned my camera off. But there's an extraordinary amount of bald eagles in my section of Arlington near 4 Mile Run,
Yes.
and actually osprey as well. There's actually tons of water birds, heron, osprey. I've seen a belted kingfisher.
Hmm.
It's pretty amazing just walking down that little tributary.
That's
Beautiful.
awesome.
Proof that our work at PRKN is having some impact. I'll give a final few seconds if anyone else wants to chime in and ask a question. Elizabeth, did I interrupt you? Do you have another comment or were you finished, my dear? Nope, you're good. Okay, thanks. So last call, if anyone wants to ask Charlotte, she doesn't mind if you haven't read her book yet. We've
Mm-mm.
covered a lot of ground. So
Oh, I have a question.
sure.
Um, how did you find your publisher? How did you pitch this topic to a publisher, the blend of history and memoir sounds wonderful.
Sure. Well, it's another love story, if you can believe it. No, as I said before, I'm originally from North Carolina, and I had published one of the first sort of non-academic things I had published, was very much a blend of memoir and history and sort of ecology that I had published in a smaller journal, the Southern Humanities Review, which is published out of Auburn University. And my publisher, who I feel like actually is on the call right now, hey Laura, if you're here, she had read it because she had also worked for the Southern Humanities Review. And she had contacted me to say, hey, like if you are writing a book, I think I had put at the end of my bio, I'm working on a book about the Potomac, like let me know. And then we worked on it for 2, 3 years together, in concert. And Laura, hi, I just saw you said hello in the chat. Um, I mean, we shaped it together. The process of writing any book means that a lot ends up on the cutting room floor. Um, and a lot that I had never imagined would enter the book became part of the book. I think when I initially thought I was writing a book about the Potomac, I didn't really imagine there would be as much memoir or my own sort of relationship to the river in this book. But Laura, my publisher, Bellevue Literary Press, really helped blend those things together, and I think therefore make the book more intimate. Um, and I will say too, I just think more readable. Um, a history for those of us who love the Potomac, a history of the Potomac sounds great, but a collection of essays exploring the plants and the history and the geography and the city and the river, that brings more people together, I think.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Charlotte, let's close with one last passage where
Yeah,
you talk
absolutely.
about your ritual of going out to the Potomac on every solstice and equinox. You've lived in the area 6 or 7 years now, but every year, 4 times a year, you go out before sunrise with tea and supplies that you can use to forage for food. Maybe we'll do another webinar on what kind of food you're finding.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
Sometimes you're with friends, sometimes you're alone, and you don't return home on those 4 days of the year until the sun has set. So can you please read to us a particular passage about a winter solstice in December where it's icy and foggy and you set out before sunrise?
Oh, absolutely. Um, okay. The fog was so heavy I couldn't tell when the sun first lifted over the city. In one moment, I could not see what was in front of me, and in the next I could. Mist rolled down river steady and slow, as if each particulate in the air was bound to a molecule of water. Sun seeped through the haze, but hadn't yet split the ridge. Leaning and lonely, the snow-crusted sycamores out on the small islands began to appear as the air warmed. And then all the light was in the top of the trees. Tall oaks glowed as if lit from within. Another minute now, and the peaks of both ridges were on fire. Bright heat filtered down branches and boles so unhurried that I hardly recognized the light line was moving towards the water. In winter, especially in the snow, the sunrise does not turn the landscape gold or yellow, but sharper and silvery. The ripples between the rocks turned white at their crest, then softened. The river was blue, so blue, as the mist dissolved. I watched for another 10 minutes as the river turned a bold and bright color, a blue beyond all blues, until it reached some maximal hue. I closed my eyes and could still feel it on the other side of my eyelids, a shade I dreamed of enveloping myself in, as if under a heavy quilt or close in someone's arms. Then, in an instant, the sunrise was over and the morning was on. The water returned to its usual pearl gray. There are times when my love for the Potomac catches up with me, and I am shocked that I could have forgotten, even for a breath, that every minute by this river is a revelation. I do not know of a greater gift from a lover than that of a good surprise, a flick of something new that draws curiosity and sparks wonder. That the river grants me these moments of astonishment every day, if only I can will myself to go out and discover them, is a generosity I never dared to dream of before moving to DC.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So with those beautiful words, Charlotte, we will close. Thank you for sharing your Potomac Fever with us. And thanks to all the guests who joined us today, including those who are our members and supporters. If you don't support us yet, we'd love you to join us to help us keep the Potomac, the Shenandoah, and all their tributaries swimmable, fishable, drinkable for years to come, so that maybe in 100 years, another Charlotte Fryar will be writing about this beautiful river. Thank you so much.
Thanks. It was so great.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Yep, I'm gonna go ahead and leave if that's
You
okay.
probably have to go teach. Take
I
care.
do.
Thanks
I'll
all.
send you an email. Thanks, guys.
Okay, bye-bye.